It's a disease that's devastated millions of people around the world and continues to spread at an alarming rate. Is the Christian church doing all it can to help stem the rates of infection and to help those suffering from the effects of this epidemic? Or has HIV/AIDS become something we just don't talk about?
Hello and welcome to Intersection. I'm Bettina Krause. Since the very beginning of the HIV/AIDS epidemic, the Christian church has often struggled to define its attitude and its response. Today we hear the voices of those who blame Christians for failing to take quicker action when it comes to AIDS. In fact, one British writer accused Christians of having a childlike attitude to human sexuality. These are difficult words to hear, but is there any truth to what he's saying? We're talking today about Christians and AIDS, and I'm very pleased to welcome Dr. Alan Handysides, who is Director of Health Ministries for the Seventh-day Adventist World Church. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Bettina.
And Pastor Pardon Mwanza, who is a General Vice President of the Seventh-day Adventist World Church. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you.
And Sonia Funner, who is a Technical Advisor for Health for the Adventist Development and Relief Agency International. Thanks so much for being here.
Thank you.
Now, I think this is going to be a really interesting and important discussion. But before we get started, let's take a closer look at some of the issues involved.
We still perceive HIV and AIDS as a consequence of our wrong choices and sinful behavior, but we need to understand that there are many women and children in Africa and other parts of the world that they didn't do anything like wrong choices. So we need to have a better loving and caring attitude in our churches, and also we need to be involved in social service and support.
HIV/AIDS is a very complex issue, and in the short term we believe that in order for the message of prevention to pass, we need openness of mind and to talk openly about this and to give the necessary knowledge to the people. When we say necessary knowledge, it means that if you have a superficial knowledge of the problem, it is possible that you will get infected. But if you really know what this disease is all about, the dynamics of the infection and the means of prevention, then it is possible that you will think twice before getting involved in a risky behavior that will lead to an HIV infection. It's very important the time we spend with our children in the long term. That's why we said the short term is what we can do now, but the long term is a good investment. We are talking about the future generations free of HIV.
We need to help them to stop the denial. They need to understand that HIV and AIDS, yes, it's prevalent in Africa and in other parts, but it's just a matter of time that the disease can be also a big problem here or in other countries. We find suffering, we find pain, especially when you see the orphans, like a small girl that is head of a household, and you see mothers that the husband has died, so it's very painful. But for us personally, we like to be in direct contact with those people because for us has the opposite effect. That is a motivation not to give up when things are not, perfect. We remember about them and we say we need to continue because of them.
And I would like to add that what makes our work not easier but more easy to deal with is when we try to position ourselves and see the things through Jesus' eyes and try to think how Jesus will think about this, how Jesus will react in front of the pain and the suffering that we have to witness many times in our work, and that helps a lot. Sometimes there is a situation that we don't know probably how to respond to, what words to use, and we think, what would Jesus do if he would be in our place today, here, now, in front of this situation? And it's like immediately, you know what to do, you know what to say, because if you look to this situation through the eyes of Jesus and the heart of Jesus, it's much easier, it's much better, and we will see miracles happen in front of our eyes.
So what do you think? Are we still, as a Christian community, struggling with this issue?
Of course we are. You know, people struggle with an issue like this, whether they're Christians or not Christians.
Okay.
This is a problem that goes to the very heart of the individual. We always judge other people, other people's motives, other people's behaviors, and we do it from a position where we think that we are superior. And because we have a Christian faith, sometimes we think that we are a cut above the rest of humanity.
And I think, Bettina, the other thing is, when HIV and AIDS came to be known,
Yes.
it was introduced negatively. It was introduced as something that comes to people as a result of behavior that's immoral.
Right.
So that has stuck in people's minds, and the church, being a definer of morals, finds itself caught into this.
I remember, early news reports of AIDS, they would refer to it as a gay disease.
Well, the
As
first
a-
5 cases were reported on June 5, 1981. Strange, it was an immunoincompetence in 5 gay men. That was what appeared in the MMR. And so the die was set. This was a disease among homosexuals. And of course, the Christian community has not done very well by homosexuality either.
Right.
And so you then had a coupling together of 2 problems. One is the church's response to homosexuality, and the other was then a judgmental response to a disease, and a tendency to want to speak on behalf of God. We
Right.
always want to speak on behalf of God.
And just as you mentioned, I mean, it is a human issue. People just have a really difficult time accepting that there are human beings that suffer from this, and they should not necessarily be stigmatized for it.
Exactly.
And it's ironic when you look at where AIDS is most pervasive and the level of stigma that is associated in those areas, where there is the greatest need to be more accepting and to deal with the issue at hand. So if it isn't a religious issue, it's cultural beliefs or
Right.
other beliefs that get in the way.
For Christians, though, this whole attitude problem was perhaps fueled by some unfortunate remarks by prominent people in the Christian church, talking about AIDS as a judgment of God. What's wrong with this reasoning from a biblical perspective?
So one of the problems with that is that it assumes that everybody who is HIV positive sinned or
Right.
did something wrong. That is not true. What did a 2-year-old child
Exactly.
with HIV and AIDS do?
But in that argument too, we have to be very careful, because what we're suggesting is that maybe the ones who did sin and get it, it was a judgment of God, but the others who got it were not. Even when they sinned, it's not a judgment of God. You
I'm
see,
with you. Yeah.
it's not God doesn't inflict punishment on us. We bear the consequences
Right.
of our behavior. And so these are natural consequences, not God's judgment. And by that attitude, we are unfair to both the person who's having to live with HIV, and we're unfair to God. Just as those who criticize people for that attitude, which is a very natural human attitude, are also guilty of judging others. And really what the world needs is a little bit more tolerance, a little less judgment, and a little bit more ability to see need
And to love.
to be like
Right.
Jesus. Yes.
And once you have cast people to the side, once you have deemed that they are now responsible for this,
Right.
it really creates a vicious cycle because there's no learning from it. And it goes right back to acceptance and stigma and trying to break down some of these barriers that stop this disease from spreading in the first place. But the
Right.
second that you cast them aside and you've determined that they are responsible and
Well, you can
It's just a-
abdicate your own responsibility quite happily, can't you, at that point? Because you're saying
now you
they're-
are taking the moral high ground because they are the
Right.
ones that have sinned and they have brought this upon themselves.
So in our own minds, we sometimes unconsciously make the distinction between innocent victims and victims, well, not victims, people who've brought it upon themselves.
Yes, and I don't think we should be doing that either.
No, I don't
No.
think we should.
Yeah.
I think it's the problem of HIV/AIDS is so big that if we get stuck at the who, why,
Yes.
we don't address the issue
The issue,
itself.
Right.
Yes.
So
And we create for ourselves an insensibility to an individual's need. You know, if I need $100 and I look to you for $100, I'm a burden to you because, you know, you came by that $100 a hard way. If you can reason within yourself that I don't deserve it, you feel very good just keeping it in your pocket and walking off spending it for something that you want rather than something I need. And so really this business of castigating others, of putting a stigma on them is a mechanism to release ourselves from any responsibility to their care or
Now,
or
Bettina,
assistance.
I think it would also be fair in balancing the picture to say that certain behavioral patterns do make it easy for people to contract the disease.
Okay.
HIV.
Yes.
I think
And
it's better for
important.
us to balance that.
Yes.
Well, let's pick that one up after the break, shall we? When we come back, getting past the statistics and seeing the human face of HIV/AIDS. Welcome back. We're talking today about the response of the Christian Church to HIV/AIDS. Now, before the break, you mentioned that yes, we have to acknowledge that there are certain patterns of behaviour that are going to increase the likelihood of transmission. How does the Christian Church communicate that, but in a non-morally superior or morally arrogant way?
One way is, you know, the commandments of God were not meant to be used just as a standard for entry into heaven, but as barriers against hurting ourselves, hurting our neighbors. And so we need to come in a way that helps people say, you know what, this kind of behavior can hurt you, can hurt your family,
Right.
will hurt those around you.
Okay.
That is more humane than to come and say, this is wrong.
Yes.
You're going to
Yes.
all that.
Yes.
Yeah.
Which happens.
You know, AIDS is a really big focus for us at ADRA in health globally.
Right.
We have standalone HIV/AIDS prevention programs, and we also have integrated HIV/AIDS prevention messages in a lot of our programs. That is a mechanism. Communication is a huge mechanism that we use to get this out there. Just the facts, as you were saying, not finger pointing, but just the facts. And we
Right.
work through community-based organizations, faith-based organizations, church groups, pathfinders, youth. And you were just mentioning the receptiveness of youth.
You know,
So
we
it's-
as a church are so used to preaching. And this is an area where preaching falls flat on its face. You don't preach to a person who's got an infection.
Right.
What you do is you demonstrate love and
Exactly.
support. I once remember hearing a man say, they don't hear a word you're saying because they're deafened by your actions. And if the Christian church could be seen, and not just seen, but actually be involved in demonstrating Christ's compassion,
Yes.
actually helping these people, it doesn't really matter too much what you think about how they got it.
Right.
If you love them, they will be able to communicate with you and relate to you, and through the relationship, you'll develop a channel to communicate your values. You know, it's a little bit like closing the gate when the horse has fled.
Right.
When you're talking to somebody who has HIV. There's no longer any need for recrimination. There's no point crying over the spilt milk. What you have to do is wipe it up and get on and live with the current situation. And to the best of your ability.
Now, you are talking from the perspective of someone who has actually experienced and seen what it is like for someone to suffer from HIV/AIDS. Me and many of the people watching, their only experience with AIDS is going to be through statistics, through newspaper reports. Can you tell us, each of you, what is it really like for an individual, a family, a community to deal with this problem?
First of all, this is one reason why HIV and AIDS as a subject discussed by different people sometimes has different meanings.
Right.
If you've never touched or seen a person struggle through the challenges of that virus to the point where sometimes they are reduced to bones, and you finally see them die, your perspective about it changes. I have seen friends, I have seen fellow pastors, I have seen relatives who have died of HIV and AIDS, and it's not something, it's a very hard thing to pass through or to see.
And
to sit around a table and eat with people, a couple as I've done, who both HIV positive. One knows that the other one actually was the first one infected and infected them. And the dynamic of the marriage has to exist through that. And then they have to say, we have 3 children, and 2 of them are infected. The amount of guilt and turmoil and anguish, and then as you sit and talk with them, you realize that the one of them, you know, he's sweating a little bit, he's breathing a little faster, maybe he's got tuberculosis, and you hear that he died 3 weeks later. Then you begin to say, how would I exist? How would I cope with that situation? Would I be then saying, well, you know, this is a judgment of God? I mean, what kind of, what a terrible, terrible attitude. And we would call ourselves Christians to be like that? We haven't learnt the very rudiments. He without sin cast the first stone. Jesus encountered that every day in the Pharisees. And I'm afraid that as Christians, we are Pharisaical. And much as I, you know, feel that way, yet we as Christians also are driven by our conscience to do something. And I think that the church has changed. If we were to look on the board that we serve on, over the last 10 years, how we have moved, and the church has moved both corporately and with the people, we are beginning to see the responsibility that we have.
okay, we need to take a short break, but when we come back, dealing with the sometimes contentious issue of AIDS prevention.
AIDS has had a devastating effect on our community. It's almost wiped out an entire generation. We have a lot of orphans when you have a lot of old people, especially in areas like Soweto and Lesotho.
And the AIDS problem is there in Portugal, but because of our economy, we can survive with that. And the people can go and check and can get a lot of help there.
We have some problem with AIDS because some people, the young people, don't care about that, and the community, the health community, work with this problem, but it's not enough.
There's a lot of stigma, especially to those, especially pregnant women or women with kids. How you're not supposed to really breastfeed your kids after when you have HIV.
It really currently is affecting Sudan tremendously because we don't have really a kind of AIDS awareness.
AIDS is still a problem in Zambia. The message is there, but because we have people that are not educated, so they are not getting the message as they should, so it is still a problem.
There have been some awareness campaigns that have been put up, and I think there's a bit more concentration on the whole issue than there was before. The literacy rate is increasing on that issue. I think more people are aware and more people are taking some steps.
In spite of being a small country, but we are also affected by it, although it's not a big part of the population, but it's there. And the government is trying to encourage people to use condoms, preservatives, etc.
Well, the government is doing a lot. They have started this program where they encourage everybody to go and get tested, regardless of whether you think you need to or not. And the president was in fact the first person to get tested.
The government and our church, the Seventh-day Adventist Church, is doing a lot when it comes to teaching young people about abstinence.
HIV/AIDS has affected the community in Lesotho in a very negative way, because now at the moment we have so many orphans whom their parents died because of HIV and AIDS, and the church also has been affected in a very tremendous way, because we have people who are dying in church, and for so many times we've been ignoring it, thinking that it's an illness that comes from outside and all that. But until it affected our church, we saw our leaders, some of our leaders passing away, some of our friends passing away, and our parents passing away. We started to see how impacting this HIV and AIDS is.
Welcome back. We're talking today about the Christian Church's responsibility in the fight against HIV/AIDS. Now, in the break, Sonia, you were talking about the impact of AIDS and HIV on families, specifically children.
Yeah, the children that are left behind that become parents and adults overnight, and they're often the silent victims because they did not have a choice, and now they are left to take care of younger siblings, and they're left to fend for entire households. And in our programs, we do work with orphans and vulnerable children, and we do our best to try to link them with resources.
Right.
But our best is good, but there's still a lot of children out there that suffer.
Give us an idea of the scope of this. I mean, do we understand how big this really is?
Orphans and vulnerable children. I don't have specific numbers. I mean, millions.
13 million in Africa.
Is that right?
Africa
13
alone.
million in Africa alone.
Yeah.
Yeah, but maybe picture it this way, Bettina. You have 3 children. The oldest is 8 years. Parents die, and the 8-year-old child becomes the most responsible person to provide, to care,
food,
and
shelter,
to guide
education.
Those siblings for the rest of. How possible is that? I mean, that's hard.
You know, we've been talking about the horrific effects of HIV/AIDS. Let's talk a little bit about prevention and education. This has not been an easy subject for the Christian Church. Why is that?
Education as a standalone strategy fails.
And now you're talking about education in terms of abstinence?
When you stand up and you talk about, just even the education.
Right.
If you talk about abstinence, if you talk about using condoms, if you talk, whatever you want to talk about, not using needles,
right.
Education flies over the top of the head unless you have a relationship with the person to whom you are talking, with whom you're communicating. And therefore, the importance of the Christian Church to establish a kindly, loving relationship with the community, a hand of help rather than a voice of instruction. Only then are you going to be heard. And that's why all these programs have failed, because they're coming across as a preachy type of message, and that's not what's needed.
So what are you saying? Are you saying that Christians need to recognize their idealism but get real, get practical?
Yes.
Okay.
That's the only way to combat it, and it's the only way to fight the challenges that go along with everything we've been talking about, with stigma, with the vicious cycle. It is the only way, is to just present them as facts and do not present them as though you're speaking at people. But you have to bring people in. They have to understand what is happening, and in order to be able to even get messages of prevention, even accepted.
I would advocate for a comprehensive approach.
Okay.
In other words, use anything and everything that will stop the spread of HIV and AIDS.
And everyone, if I can chime in. You know, it's don't just focus on our church groups, reach out.
Now,
communities.
What then would you say to a Christian who said, well, the church has a moral responsibility to be a voice for what's right and what's wrong, and we abdicate it if we go along with some of these more practical methods of AIDS prevention and education.
The church has not a moral responsibility to be a voice. It has to be like Jesus.
Okay.
But we also, in addition, we need to remember a church is like a hospital. Jesus said, I came not for those who are well, I came for those who are sick. Meaning, let's not make the church appear like it's some absolute perfect entity.
Right.
That's deceiving ourselves. The church is full of sick people, some of whom are healed in 1 week, 1 year, 10 years. And so we've got to be practical.
The church is, on Monday, is you, wherever you are on Monday.
Right.
And Wednesday, it's wherever I am. Right now, the church is around this table discussing this issue. But there are Adventists, members of the church, who are making shoes, building houses, fixing roads. And some of them also have an HIV infection. So let's remember that the church has a good proportion of its members, just probably reflective of the community, suffering with and battling with HIV. So
it's not a problem external to us?
It's not a problem external to us.
I have 2 daughters and 2 sons. You bet I will do everything and anything to prevent my kids from contracting HIV and AIDS. Simply, whatever, teaching anything. Because to me, the worst thing is to say, I wish I had done that when it's too late.
So it all comes down to the worth of human life.
Exactly.
Yes. Now, we need to wrap up, but can I just get from each of you one last word? What is the most important message that you would give people watching about HIV/AIDS and our attitude as Christians?
Well, we've touched on Jesus' ministry, and in his healing ministry, he fraternized with the rejects. He fraternized with people who were outcasts, with the lepers and the blind. And if we purport to be Christ followers, if we purport to be Christians, we can do no less. We absolutely have to approach people with this disease and communicate everything surrounding it and getting messages out with openness and understanding.
Do unto others as you would have others do unto you.
Simple but profound.
People with HIV are no better and no worse than I am.
Thank you so much. It has been a fascinating discussion and one that I think is very important. And thank you for joining us as well. It's your faith, it's your world. Please keep the conversation going, and we'll see you next time on Intersection.